Hi, everybody. This is Ian Powers from Right Sports, and I've got a former colleague to join us today on the podcast. His name is Christian Red. He was, we worked together for a decade at the New York Daily News. Uh, so I was there for a short portion of his tenure, and he was member for that time of the sports investigative team, one of the best groups doing that kind of work in a sports newsroom in the country. And so I've now that I'm on Substack, I know that I've been a subscriber to Christian's Substack newsletter for, I want to say a year at least. And because I saw Christian posting about it on LinkedIn and been following it because a lot of the stories that he shares, I was there while he was doing those things. I was editing
Indeed.
his work, and Christian has a very interesting path and very interesting stories to tell because uh, he has some skills that were very helpful, I think, to the Daily News Sports Department, and now he's got a very varied journey since we both left the Daily News, and I think he'll bring some good insights to us about his entrepreneurial journey since his time at the Daily News and what he's doing now. And thank you, Christian, for coming on.
My
How
pleasure.
are you today?
I'm well. I'm well. It's nice to be reacquainted with a longtime colleague in a new platform.
uh, oh yeah. This is the whole point of what I'm trying to do is we've got to be able to find new avenues, and we do good work, and I think people need to hear it
I appreciate
and
it.
see it
I appreciate
and read
it.
it. So Christian, tell everybody about, like, they know now that you and I worked at the Daily News, but why don't you give us a little snapshot of your history as a sport or as a writer and then sports writer,
Yeah,
content creator.
it was not a traditional path in the sense that I was in a completely different field before I got into journalism. And as I was just telling you, I started in trade publishing in the early 90s. I moved to Manhattan and about a year after I graduated from Hamilton College and spent a decade in that capacity. It was the business side of publishing. I don't know how much that role exists anymore, but it was a licensing role. So trying to the nutshell version is trying to extend the longevity of the book in different forms, whether it was a serial right or in a magazine or audio rights and that kind of thing. But then I switched gears, went back to fortunate enough to be accepted to journalism's prestigious J School and went there and earned my master's. And right before I was going to graduate from J School, one of my professors, who is still a very powerful woman in the media industry, Eve Burton, she used to be the counsel at the Daily News, and she had long since left the Daily News and had worked at CNN. But there was a small window where she taught First Amendment law at the J School, and I had her for that class. And after I had her, we established, cultivated a source, so to speak. And she, right before we graduated, she said, what do you have lined up? And I said, I don't really have anything. I was expecting to go to a small market or a small town and work my way up in whatever role might be available. And she had, as you can imagine, a Rolodex to envy for anybody in that industry. So she went down the Rolodex and listed a bunch of names that I could contact and use her as a reference, which, as you can imagine, was incredible. So one of the people that she mentioned I should speak to was Terry Thompson, who was one of the sports editors at the Daily News and had, at that time, this is circa 2002, Terry had already established the investigative team, the I team, within the Daily News sports department. So at the time, it was TJ Quinn and Mike O'Keefe. They were part of that team. Luke Cyphers, another former Daily Newser, was also on the I team, but he had left the Daily News at that time. So when I met with Terry Thompson, you might remember this, Ian, there was a really old school diner down the street on 33rd Street, down the street from the Daily News offices, which were on 33rd and 10th. And this was on the corner of 9th Avenue. And I can't remember what the name of it was, but
The Cheyenne.
The Cheyenne, yes.
The Cheyenne.
Yes, that's where we met. And here's a valuable lesson for your listeners, Ian, and for anyone that aspires to go into journalism, is whoever you interview with for whatever role at whatever outlet or entity, know what's going on at that particular place. In other words, know what they're covering, what kind of style they may use or reporters may use, what kind of focus they may be trying to achieve. All of those things, because I didn't do any of that. And I met with Terry and I had my senior thesis from J School and a couple of clips on the Columbia, journalism school news site. And this is the early 2000s, so this is well before any kind of social media or anything like that, Substack and such. And she proceeded to ask me what I thought about the topics that they were covering with the I team. And again, it was very early for the I team, but they still had accomplished a great deal of great work. And I didn't know anything. I didn't even know TJ and Mike were part of the I team. So the next 20 minutes of lunch interview were dead silence, literally. And I walked out of there with my tail between my legs and went back to wherever my apartment or back to Columbia and thought that was the end of it. And then the summer rolled by. I got a internship at the tabloid TV show that I can't, Inside Edition. And there were a couple of J School graduates there, but it didn't pan out to anything. And at the end of the summer, it was my then girlfriend, but now wife. She said, go back to Eve Burton. She was so helpful. So I did, and sure enough, Eve said, whatever happened with Terry Thompson? And I said, it didn't really go that well. And she said, I'll call her again. I'll get her on the phone. And I was, no. And the next time was a little better result. She invited me to come do some high school sports coverage for the Daily News, which I don't even know if that exists anymore. It hasn't existed for years.
No.
But that was the start of it. That was the start, and I just continued to try and get involved with any story or topic that I could outside of the high school coverage, which was the first kind of gig that I had. That was the start. And that was in the fall of 2002.
Wow. So I didn't get to the Daily News till 2007.
Uh-huh.
So you had some years to churn out and get an idea of where your place is, and then, so you didn't start out with the I team, but you eventually gravitated towards it.
Well, yes is the short answer, but like I just mentioned, one of the things I would do after most of the high school games, the football games particularly, were on the weekends. So I would come in during the week just to be there, and that's when I started asking Terry, because she was my first connection to the sports department. And I asked her, what can I do? Can I look up anything? And one of those times early on paid off. The I team was doing a series on new sports stadiums and how those events would impact a neighborhood or a community, negatively and positively. And one of the authors that I had worked with during my publishing days had written a book on that very topic called Major League Losers. And it was all about new sports stadiums and their impact and mostly negative reverberations from, when it happens, whether it's taxpayer money or uprooting, an entire community and having them move elsewhere, whatever it was. So that book was my sort of end to that particular series of stories that the Daily News I-Team was doing. And then from then on, I just kept asking her, can I get involved with, they seemed like really cool stories that they were doing. And not that any other assignments like sidebars were any less interesting, but this was a kind of a consistent thing that they were doing. So that's what I did. And I would say in 2003 and 2004, I was working with the I-Team, but not on an official basis, just helping.
You were contributing, but
contributing
not,
when I could. And then the big year was 2005, when a lot of different stories started to reverberate, but I was a catalyst in two or three of those key stories.
I mean, so to give my listeners, the Christian started to talk about like performance enhancing drugs and baseball, I think is where you're headed right now, in which the Daily News I-Team was one of the forefront investigative units on that storyline for years. And Christian, was it 2005 when the McGuire story?
It was. So just going back to what you said, when Terry began the I-Team, and I want to say it was 2000, that unit had already done some incredible stories on the performance, the PED stigma, and that whole steroid era of particularly baseball, but professional sports as well. And in 2004, and again, I wasn't part of the I-Team in an official capacity, but I kept volunteering to do stuff, and Terry sent me to Washington for a hearing that was on steroids in sports. And it's amazing to think about now, but Biden was the co-chair of the hearing, the Senate co-chair, and I included this in a Substack post, but if you Google that hearing and see his remarks, it's amazing. It's so eloquent, and Chuck Grassley was the other co-chair. But the hearing involved a mystery witness. And no joke or exaggeration, the witness came in with a cloak on his head. And his voice, and he took the stand behind a clouded, a set of panels, so that no one could see him, and his voice was distorted like C-3PO in Star Wars, and it was this very garbled. You could understand it, but it was It was changed so that his identity could be totally protected. And so that was one witness, and there was a convicted felon who was a dealer, who was another witness, and then they had some names that may not mean anything to your listeners, but Don Catlin was a foremost anti-doping expert, was one of the witnesses as well. And the purpose was to see how big a problem this was. And and Taylor Hooton's dad, Don Hooton, was a witness as well. And again, for listeners that may not know, Don Hooton's son Taylor was a rising baseball prospect in high school, and ultimately died by suicide. And his father was adamant that steroids were the reason that caused the suicide. And not to go too deep into that, but a foundation was set up in Taylor Hooton's name right around that time, and Don Hooton was a witness on that panel. And also, there's the tie to baseball professionally that Don Hooton's, I believe it's his cousin, is Bert Hooton, who was one of the Dodgers pitchers that gave up Reggie Jackson's 3 home runs in the clinching 1977 World Series, Dodgers-Yankees. So it was a very interesting hearing. It was sort of on the prefaced a lot of what was to come. But because of that hearing, I established a source, and it turned out to be Mark McGwire's personal steroid dealer. The guy's name is Kurt Winslow, and he was one of the witnesses on that panel. And I established contact with him after the hearing, and we kept in touch throughout the rest of 2004. And as 2005 started, the first thing that came out was Jose Canseco's steroid tome, what everyone refers to it, called Juiced. And it was all about his major league career, but particularly the sort of explosion of steroid use during his time. And then that obviously continued throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. But that was the first sort of big event of 2005. That came out in early February 2005. And Kurt Winslow...
That kind of triggered some of those hearings, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
so Kurt Winslow was... he had mentioned Canseco during the time that we had established... I cultivated a relationship with him. And also he mentioned, he said, you should get in touch with the FBI agent that busted me. He led this whole investigation into steroid use, not totally from the standpoint of what was going on in baseball, but there was an FBI investigation that started in Michigan and ultimately led to the arrest of Kurt Winslow and many other dealers. And Winslow, to avoid jail, copped a plea and cooperated with the investigation. And he pointed me to that FBI agent. So right after Canseco's book came out, I got in touch with this agent, and he too mentioned that Canseco's name and McGwire's name had surfaced during their investigation, which was it started in 1989 and then lasted through early 90s. And the purpose, and both FBI agents I'm still in touch with, one is the lead agent was Greg Stayskull, who was based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the other was Bill Randall, and he's from Chicago originally, but he was the other lead agent on this case. And the purpose was to try and get the dealers. It was never about. So the interesting thing about that conversation, and I ultimately did reach out to this FBI agent, and surprisingly, he called me back. And even more surprising is he talked on the record about what he had gleaned from that investigation. And not only was it to try and, again, find the dealers that were, carrying out this steroid operation that extended beyond Michigan, but he, meaning Greg Stayskull, the former FBI agent, had reached out to Major League Baseball, or so he told me. And I'll never forget this, Ian. I was on the phone with him, and he was telling me this, and I was signaling to Terry Thompson and to Mike O'Keefe, who was in the office that day as well, what this agent was telling me. So it was like this real-time adrenaline, nail-biting experience. Like, I don't want to compare it to Watergate, but it was that kind of thrill where we were, and me specifically, were gleaning this incredible intel from a reliable source, and he was on the record. So he went on to tell me about how he had reached out to baseball and had warned them about the steroid problem, because he explained to he told us that he had talked to Kevin Hallinan, who used to be the head of security for Major League Baseball, and he had told Hallinan, these names came up during this investigation into steroid trafficking, and you might want to check it out. So that was in the early 90s, like in 94, I want to say, and it was at a Quantico FBI event. So a decade later almost, he's telling me, and then also O'Keefe after he joined the call, all about this meeting with Major League Baseball. So that sparked what would be a really explosive back page right on the heels of Canseco's book being published. And O'Keefe had done a big feature on Canseco's book before it came out, because the Daily News had been able to get the early draft or the galleys of that book before it hit the shelves. So on the heels of that, we have this explosive back page that says, "They knew," and it had a picture of then Commissioner Bud Selig with his head in his hands, from another event in his tenure, but it perfectly encapsulated what the headline said. And of course, we had to go to baseball to get their comment, and they said we were completely inaccurate with our reporting, and even I still have the letter, but they issued a letter saying how our reporting was inaccurate, and we stuck by it. Obviously, we had what we thought were impeccable sources, and that, as you alluded to earlier, that really, those events, and then there was a 60 Minutes between Mike Wallace and Canseco that came out around that time. But all of those events sparked this congressional hearing. and that was in March of 2005. And then what it was were all the commissioners from the different sports leagues, but the focus was on baseball. And
Right.
As you remember, and if your listeners don't, that 2005 congressional hearing featured Mark McGuire as a witness, Jose Canseco as a witness, Sammy Sosa, Rafael Palmeiro, and Kurt Schilling. And Frank Thomas was there, but by video only. But those players, former and current, were on the stand. And McGuire's famous testimony was, "I'm not here to talk about the past," when he was questioned by committee members. It was the House Oversight Committee, questioned by committee members on whether or not he had used steroids or anything related to steroids. He didn't plead the fifth, but basically did. And it was a remarkable event. But right before the hearing started, and I was down in Washington for it with Terry and with Mike O'Keefe and with TJ Quinn. And there were, as you can imagine, scores of different outlets there to cover the event. But as I was walking to get my credential for the hearing, I was by myself, and one of McGuire's reps called me and I thought that it was going to be, we're going to sue you or we're going to take action against you. But we had just published sort of the second part of this explosive coverage. So we had the They Knew back page, and then days before the hearing, we had an exclusive on who McGuire's steroid source was during his playing days, and it was Kurt Winslow, the guy I mentioned from the 2004 hearing that I covered. And Winslow himself hadn't confirmed it, but we had confirmed that he was McGuire's dealer through multiple sources. And that was also an explosive back page. It was Mark of a Cheater, and it had a picture of McGuire, and it was a 4-page expose, if you will, and it went right down to the very steroid cocktail that Winslow provided for McGuire during his playing days. So when I got this call from one of his reps, it was bracing yourself for what every journalist fears, which is a lawsuit or worse. And instead it was, you guys are, I'm paraphrasing, but it was, you guys are doing a great job. Or this is great work. You would never get that, in any other,
from someone you're exposing.
It was surreal. There's no other way to put it. But when I told that to Terry and Mike and TJ, after the call, they were like, that was, as you can imagine, for Terry especially, was a huge sign of relief. It didn't totally put us in the clear, but that was a pretty big step towards, being confident about our reporting, which we were anyway. But again, you always worry about, sensitive stories leading to some kind of backlash.
Christian, this reminds me of just the state of media today, and maybe it's a comment on it. Like your team, and I'd say most of the journalists that I've ever worked with or encountered are very ethical and very, they try to get everything right. And your team, you said your connection to meet Terry Thompson was through Eve Burton, who was a lawyer for the Daily News.
Correct.
At certain points. Like your team, in how difficult some of the stories you were working on, you were always working almost in parallel with the legal
Yes.
entities of the Daily News. You wanted to make sure everything you were doing was right journalistically, constitutionally. You were always, and I think most journalists still try to abide by that. And I think it's I love that you're giving us a little insight to that fact. You're vetting sources, you're confirming multiple times over before you print a story, what especially with sensitive material.
Yep.
And it's and everybody, Christian, I'm going to provide a link to Christian's Substack, and Christian really does a good job in some of his posts of getting behind the scenes of these stories like he's giving you here. And it's very interesting I think so many people have such a awful opinion of media today and journalists today that I think sometimes we need to hear what we actually go through and what we've actually gone through in the work that we do, to try to get it right and to serve our public, and our readership. So I'm sorry.
No, you bring up a very important point, and especially in this today's culture, not only is the media often vilified or looked at in a negative manner, but you see these, I don't want to say they're attacks, but this administration taking on media entities and being, in some cases, successful at doing that, whether it's the Stephanopoulos lawsuit that resulted in a victory for the Trump administration, or a capitulation, and then more recently with Jimmy Kimmel and that whole scenario. So it's
CBS News,
CBS News, exactly, with the whole new ownership.
Not just the Colbert, but what's going on at 60 Minutes, like the Colbert's entertainment, but that's a free speech issue. But I think I think it's distracting intentionally from what's happening in the actual news arm of that organization.
Yeah, and I would even go from a personal standpoint to say that I still work with Terry Thompson occasionally on some stories, and we also have been pitching a couple of stories for a while now, and both of them are sensitive in nature as far as the topic and the reporting, but we're finding, and we both think that they're incredibly compelling stories, but we can't find a home for them. And I think, and I don't think I'm wrong, a lot of the reasons why there's hesitancy is because tackling difficult subjects for news stories or sports stories or whatever is challenging. And a lot of people, even if they have the benefit of a legal department that you just alluded to, are hesitant to do those stories because of fear of whatever, reprisal, lawsuit, backlash, reputation, all those things. Even if the people that are bringing the content or potential content to them are reputable reporters or have experience doing these kinds of stories, there's still hesitancy. So it's a challenging time for sure.
Going back to you've established this, how you built your investigation reputation, and as a report, you just had one source tell you, you guys are actually doing a really good job here. Your reporting is spot on, from somebody right next to one of the main topics that you're covering and that you're exposing tells you were doing you were right.
Yeah.
And that's got to be, and you were talking about that. To advance it some more, I mean, like you guys, the Daily News I-team has always been on top of this story of, I mean, you didn't write the book on Barry Bonds, but you wrote the book on Roger Clemens.
Correct.
And that is, in 2007 or 8, I can't remember exactly when the list came out of who had tested positive in the free year that everybody had been given, and all the names were exposed, or Roger Clemens was perhaps the biggest name on that list of the names that were out there. And of course, he had won World Series with the Yankees. So he was not only was he this major star for that many years, but he was also, for our readers at the Daily News especially, he was a Yankee. So it was
Correct.
And he was the ace at times of some really good teams. So, and however, one of the sources you cultivated, who has testified that he had supplied Roger with some Brian McNamee, was one of the sources that you guys cultivated in that time.
Yep.
And he was in the Mitchell report. There we go.
Correct.
That was the moment. When the Mitchell report came out and it exposed a lot of things, and Brian McNamee was one of the people, the witnesses in the Mitchell report. Is that correct?
Correct. He was the witness.
Yeah.
Aside from Kirk Radomski, who was the other key witness. Yeah, that's you bring up a very interesting time period as well. That was a few years after the congressional hearing in 2005 essentially sparked baseball, and specifically Selig, who was commissioner, to appoint the former Senator George Mitchell to carry out an investigation of basically baseball's doping culture. How prevalent was it? How far back did it go? Was it still as widespread as it was in the 80s or 90s? But I do want to make that distinction that Clemens' name, if it was on the list of 103, I believe, players that were part of the 2003 survey year, that was never reported. There were a few names. No worries. There were
my confusion names, there a little bit. Or I didn't mean to confuse things.
There were a few names that were leaked by outlets, including Alex Rodriguez's name was one of the ones that was obviously a huge name that came out in 2009 with Sports Illustrated. And also the Times reported that Sammy Sosa was on that list. Anyways, when the Mitchell report started, it was right after Selig held a press conference at MLB headquarters and announced that Mitchell would be appointed to do this. And so from 2006 through almost the end of 2007, he carried out an investigation, and it ultimately resulted in the Mitchell report, as you mentioned. And that came out in December of 2007. Among the big names included in that report as steroid cheats was Clemens and Andy Pettitte. Those actually were the biggest names, the two biggest names. And there were over 24 other names listed, but Clemens and Pettitte were the ones that stood out. As you also alluded to, Brian McNamee, who used to be a strength coach with the Yankees for 1999 and 2000 and into 2001, he was a trainer for Clemens and Pettitte outside of his role with the club, with the Yankees. And he had also worked in that capacity for the Blue Jays in 1998. So I'm sorry, he was not with the Yankees in 1999. He was with Clemens and the Blue Jays in 1998. Then Clemens was traded to the Yankees for 1999 season. And then McNamee joined the Yankees in 2000 when Clemens was already there. So in the Mitchell report, some of McNamee's testimony was that he injected steroids literally into Roger Clemens's body. And
Yep.
he did so, he claims in the report, in 1998, in 2000, and in 2001. So those were the sort of the explosive elements of that report. And
Right.
that sparked.
Like I'll tell I one of the famous things that McNamee claims is that when Roger Clemens threw the broken bat
Yep.
at Mike Piazza in the World Series,
In 2000.
he was that was an incident of roid rage because he had just recently given Roger a dose, I believe. Is that he
There was always
he
there was always speculation
there was always
after
right.
the Mitchell report was released that everyone knows the term roid rage in that kind of culture,
Right.
and that was the immediate reaction was, oh well, he threw the bat shard at Piazza in 2000, so that must have been roid rage. I don't know if McNamee ever testified in the Mitchell report or on the stand during Clemens's trial or during the congressional hearing that was the case, but that was certainly, again, for people in that culture or knew about it, that was the speculation was, oh, well, that's why he threw the bat shard, because there was no other seemingly explanation for why he would do something like that other than he didn't like Piazza because he homered off him.
So what the Mitchell report did and what you're reporting with the Daily News I team, what that started, Roger was the big name.
Correct.
That came out of that, the biggest name.
And he was the only name that contested the Mitchell report findings when they were released in 2007 in December.
There's Laticated and B12. Laticated and B12.
B12, exactly. Right. That was the famous interview with Mike Wallace in another 60 Minutes expose surrounding that steroid era, events. But yeah, the Mitchell report came out. It was a huge press conference in Manhattan when it was released. And there was a separate press conference at the Players Association. It was all kinds of. I wasn't even in Manhattan when that report was released. I was in the Dominican doing a story down there. But all of that is to say that when the Mitchell report was released, Clemens was the lone player mentioned in the report that contested the findings, and that sparked another congressional hearing 3 years after the first one. Although this one was only with Clemens and McNamee and one of Mitchell's investigators, Charlie Sheeler, was the other witness between them when they appeared before Congress.
So this is now we're getting towards what some of the things like what I'm trying to do with my audience is trying to give them ideas of what. Now, Christian and Terry Thompson and Mike O'Keefe, they spent a lot of time and resources investigate. Like, all right, what happened with Roger? Roger Clemens' story is so. He's this. He had an American dream, right? He was the best pitcher in baseball, arguably, for 15 years and maybe more. And so you guys said, what's behind Roger's story? You were doing a lot of writing, investigating. Like, how did he get to that point, and how did you were following this narrative, and you were reporting a lot in the Daily News. But what you also realized is that we have so much content that we are finding out here. You can't just put it into a 1,200 word story every Sunday in the New York Daily News. There's an idea we can build something using a lot of the reporting we've already done. We can, using what I'm trying to do with my audience, is get them to think entrepreneurially. This was, in that time, this is one of the ways you thought entrepreneurially, is that we can come up with a place of content and direct the readers that really want to engage with this content. We can make a book. We can write a book based on our reporting and on our investigative work. And I think by this time, Nate Vitton may have joined you guys by this time.
So he came aboard in late December, because he was at the press release for the Mitchell Report. So he came aboard in late 2007, and
he had a background because he had done a lot of reporting about Lance Armstrong, which is a whole other, right? Is that right?
He did. He had some experience
because he was European based,
covering cycling, and of course Lance Armstrong was a big name at that time in the late 90s.
And this was before things were. This was before, like, there were suspected things about Lance,
correct,
but there wasn't. There was nothing like when he won his 7 straight Tour de France titles, and then. So TJ Quinn had gone to ESPN before this, and Nate eventually filled his spot. I guess his role to some degree.
He did, he
as
filled
another.
His spot. And after the Mitchell Report was released, I would say within 6 months, we had the so in mid 2008 we had a book deal in place for the Roger Clemens book, and that was co-written by all 4 of us. And as you pointed out, there's only so much space, at least in the print version of the newspaper, that you can fit a story, especially one that you're covering, that extends beyond a one-off. And the Clemens story was, like the coverage a couple years later of Alex Rodriguez, was pretty much daily. We were writing stories about him. So after the Mitchell Report came out, there was a series of events that Clemens did to go on the defense. And there were internet videos where he's denying steroid use. There were press releases from his lawyer, Rusty Hardin, who's a very well-known criminal defense lawyer. And then in January, Clemens himself and Rusty held a press conference in Houston, again, to deny all the claims in the Mitchell Report. But at that press conference, they played a tape that was recorded between Clemens and McNamee. And super explosive. McNamee had no idea that they were going to do that. And then the congressional hearing was held a few weeks later in Washington, obviously, and Clemens and McNamee testified. But ultimately, the committee members believed McNamee over Clemens because he was investigated for perjury, an investigation that took place over the next couple years and ultimately resulted in Clemens being indicted by the government. So it was a remarkable time to be a journalist covering that, and on top of that, as you pointed out, finding a separate vehicle through the book to do our reporting and storytelling outside of the daily news coverage. So it was a unique time. The indictment for Clemens didn't come until 2010, and our book came out a year before that in 2009. So the book didn't cover his indictment and subsequent federal trial. And important to note that he was acquitted on all counts. So that can be part of this discussion if you want to, but that paved the way for some of the stories that I'm writing now and that other people are writing now, because Clemens has come back into focus in many ways after, I don't want to say it was an exile, but he was out of the radar for a long time following, even though he was acquitted on all counts. He was sort of low key.
Right.
But it was an exciting time, I will say that. And
well, I bet part of it is he's trying to, hopefully the veterans will vote him into the Hall at some point. That's he's definitely
absolutely.
And his son is playing in the major league, so that's always a story.
Yep.
And so another American Icon was the name of the book that you co-wrote about Roger Clemens, and then I'm just trying to move the flow a little bit more. From all your investigative reporting about steroids and everything, and and how MLB investigates, then some years down the road, and this book came out after we were both gone from the Daily News, is you wrote a book called Baseball Cop.
Correct.
About one of he was the lead investigator, I believe.
No, he was one of the investigators, but he co-founded,
hired by MLB.
Yeah, he co-founded the investigative unit that was within Major League Baseball. And again, going back to the Mitchell Report, one of the recommendations by Mitchell was that baseball should create this autonomous investigative unit separate from the labor department. It's a key point of it. But that could carry out investigations of all sorts. I mean, the focus at that time was on PEDs, so yes, it would address those issues, but any other issues that were potentially polluted with malfeasance, that was the purpose of this investigative unit. And Eddie Dominguez is the guy I wrote the...
I'm sorry, did I say his name wrong?
No,
I apologize for that. Eddie
No.
Dominguez.
So,
I have your book on my bookshelf, and I'm not recording in my apartment right now. Sorry.
No worries. He was one of the investigators, Eddie Dominguez. He's Cuban-born and was a Boston police detective for over 25 years. And his first role with baseball was as a resident security agent, which are basically the security of major league teams. And you're still, well, at the time, I don't know if it's changed as far as the organization or the setup, but at the time he was still working with the Boston Police Department and serving as a security agent for the Red Sox. But when this unit was created in baseball, he moved over to that, and he worked with a guy named Dan Mullen, who was a longtime NYPD decorated officer, and several others comprised that unit within baseball. But the book is not only about Eddie's life and career, but it's about what happened to that unit after they were all fired in 2014. So
Yeah.
interesting. It ties in the PED era. It ties in some other issues that um, continue to be difficult ones within that sport. Um, but a memoir at its heart, um, which included his long career in both law enforcement and with baseball.
Yeah, so that's what like Christian. If you follow Christian's journey, it's like you've really opened a door. Those that first hearing you went to back in 2004 really opened a door.
Yeah,
A lot of time, you know, and they say like showing up is 88% of life, and Christian was there at the right time and did the right amount of reporting and cultivated the right sources at the right time, and it opened this door to him that for the next decade plus of your career, that you were constantly breaking stories or writing stories that nobody else had. You gained trust of sources. You gained trust of your readers. That's why I would suggest going to Christian's Substack. He has a really good behind the scenes. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about Christian is there was an element to Christian that it wasn't necessarily for, let's maybe get away from the law enforcement angle so much, although it does play a role in what I'm going to talk about. But Christian's bilingual. I mean, Christian can speak Spanish, and in the baseball world, I think that is a needed asset. The great percentage of baseball players who are Spanish speaking first, and Christian, it helped Christian ingratiate himself to be able to talk with those players, maybe on a little, or players, or even people in the background on a equal level, I would say. And like Christian's latest post is about, it's the 10-year anniversary of Yoenis Cespedes coming through the Mets and helping them get to the World Series. And it was a good read about the fact that Christian went down to Cuba to try to do a background story on Cespedes's upbringing and what it was like living where he grew up in that part of Cuba. And Christian and Corey Sipkin were sent down by our sports editor at the time, and Bill Price, and who's now the editor-in-chief of NHL.com.
yes.
And
Let's go with that.
and the bitter Bill. And Cespedes, that was such a hot story. Cespedes, I mean, he ignited the city for a couple months there, and everybody wanted to know about. And oftentimes, Christian, that asset that Christian had of being bilingual. Would you say you're bilingual, or just conversational Spanish?
No.
Okay, you're bilingual. Christian's nickname is C. Rojo, like Christian Red. That his last name is Red, but his nickname is Rojo. So it's, and for Spanish for red, for those of you at home who are not as familiar. And the amount of story, like Christian said, you were in the Dominican when the Mitchell Report came out, and you were working on a story in the Dominican.
I was actually interviewing.
Christian often was sent to Latin American countries to do background stories, investigative stories, because that was his door, or I would say, to be able to, that not as, I would say at the time, not enough journalists had that in their pocket to use. And it helped, like Christian already had this established, he's already established with you like this asset of his reporting style and his ability to cultivate sources, and very good sources. And I think he applied that well when talking about what I'm saying. Like Christian, when everything was going I want to get my timing right, but here, when everything was going down with the Alex Rodriguez, as stories were coming out about his link to steroids or performance-enhancing drugs, Christian at one point went to the Dominican Republic to see how easy it is to get performance-enhancing drugs over the counter, which you would need prescriptions for here in the country, in the United States. Right. You know, so Christian was sent to do things like that, and he gets into many of these stories in his Substack, and it's a good read. It's a good collection of things, and maybe you might want to, just like there's too many things to put into the Daily News when you guys were investigating Roger Clemens, that you had a book where you could put even more of the legwork that you did, and more of the, maybe at some point some of these stories in the Substack could be a collection of stories you put into something as well in the future. Just ideas off the top of my head, and what I'm trying to say to my audience about your content ideas are never stagnant. They're never finite.
Well, thank you. I was fortunate enough to do a lot of cool stories.
Yeah.
Including the one you just mentioned, down to Cuba.
Yeah, and Christian is, so he has a Substack, and Christian also did a podcast in a very similar vein, and he had some really good guests on it. What was the name of the podcast, Christian?
It's called Stories with Street Cred, and my Substack is called More Stories with Street Cred.
Street Cred. Right.
Very similar name.
Yes.
But it's on Spotify.
See Red.
Yeah, there's some interesting chats with some wide array of people from the sports world.
You have, I think, it's really because I worked with Christian for 10 years and I was there for so many of the stories that he talks about in his Substack. It's like, oh, I remember that. I remember, it's I'm very appreciative of that time. The sports I team was so, I had a cup of, before I got to the Daily News, I had a cup of coffee at the New York Post, and they did not have an I team in the sports department at the Post. So it was very interesting. When I left the Post, my first day at the Daily News, I come in and Mike O'Keefe, I'm meeting everybody, and I'm meeting Mike O'Keefe, and I'm meeting Gary Myers was in the office that day. And they were talking about, there's about to be a congressional hearing where Mike Ditka and some other football people are going to start talking about concussions. And this is before CTE and was really a prevalent, these conversations weren't happening at the Post. We were talking about this. It was an elevated conversation about the sports world and how it affects, there's all these veterans in the NFL that are affected by concussions, and we're just starting to scratch the surface about it. And I was like, this is why I'm here, because we can have these discussions and we can try to report on them. And not to dissuade, there's a lot of really good people at the Post. I'm not saying there's not good journalism at the Post. It's just, I felt like there's different elements. And this is also close to 20 years ago, so things have changed. But it was very, the I-Team brought and Terry, especially since she led it, brought this really intelligent way of looking at some sports stories. And when I first got there was so many good people like you guys in the I-Team, and the Wayne Coffees, the Philip Bondys. There was just an elevated amount of writing and things that we were putting out, and it was a joy to be a part of that, and to know that I had a hand in at least presenting it, or and make, the words passed by my eyes before it went through. And then I even got to Terry, when Terry was eventually became the sports editor after Leon Carter left, and she gave me the I came up with a story idea, and I wasn't even pitching it for myself. I was pitching it for somebody. I wanted somebody like Christian to write it, or somebody, and she said, "No, you go write the story, Ian. I'll pay for you to go to Wyoming to write about this college basketball guy that was still alive." And
I remember that story.
It turned into a series that I won a national award for. So
Amazing.
It's very appreciative. Terry was a very good mentor, I think, and she's a very smart lady, like one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. So it's
pioneering journalist.
Yes, one like the first official female sports columnist, like at a major daily newspaper,
I don't know if that's,
or close to it, something like that.
But one of the first, if not the first.
Yeah.
Certainly, very rare to find a woman columnist in sports back when she first started in the 80s. So yeah, a really unique career in her own right. But I also wanted to touch on when you came over to the Daily News and what that time was like. This may have been before you arrived at the Daily News, but I can't remember the network. It was maybe TBS or some cable network did a.
Was it? Are you talking about the Bravo thing or whatever?
The Tabloid Wars, and it was such an interesting concept. I mean, maybe not so original, but once it was executed, it was really amazing. And it was the Daily News versus the New York Post, ostensibly. But that time in the early 2000s, when I first arrived, was so incredible with the competition. I mean, you really relished that. And you mentioned the New York Post and all of its sports staff, and many of them are still there, like longtime baseball columnists like Joel Sherman, or John Heyman is there now, but he was either at Newsday or somewhere else. And the New York Times had all these incredible reporters. So it was, and Newsday, not discounting any of the outlets, but at that time, there was such competition with whether it was the Yankees coverage or the Mets coverage or the Knicks coverage or anything sports related. The breadth of reporters in all those outlets, fighting for stories and scoops and whatnot. And it was before Twitter and X and Instagram.
I remember.
So it was a really unique thing when you got a back page or a scoop that was not in any other outlet printed edition. It was a real thrill.
And we took things so seriously, and we were big, like that. When I first got there, that was the year the Giants upset the undefeated Patriots in the Super Bowl, and we sent 19 people to cover the Super Bowl, and not just, we sent 2 gossip page writers and a gossip photographer just for the parties. I mean, that's how we treated things. Like there was an old blog, I don't know if it's still out there, but there was an old message forum called sportsjournalists.com. And there was this famous quote that's, nobody knows how to carpet bomb a big event like the Daily News. It was and we, the World Series, Yankees, Red Sox,
amazing.
It's Yankees, Mets, and seeing, I remember Brian Cashman was really mad at us once, and so he just decided to give a couple of scoops to the Post just to needle us,
things.
So that they had back page. And it's a very interesting time.
It was, and I won't discount now that, that game last night was super exciting between the Yankees and the Red Sox. But I'm not saying this because I was part of it, but you'll never get that kind of dynamic again with all those different personalities. And baseball's structure was different then as far as some of the elements that are part of today's game, the pitch clock or the runner on second base, automatic runner in extra innings. I mean, back then, in addition to those things that were changed along the way, the personalities were unmatched on both sides. And Steinbrenner was still alive.
The star.
George Steinbrenner was still alive, so there was still a little bit of gusto in his tank and bluster. So it was an exciting time, and really, all that competition stirred a lot of, as you said, emotions. Some good, some bad.
Yeah, Steinbrenner. I remember the Post and the News would always have the lowest guy they had on the totem pole at the stadium that day had to stake out Steinbrenner. It's your job. All right, if you can catch him going from his car to the to the front office door, that was your moment. And I remember
people would make fun of that, Ian. And listen, there were days when I dreaded having to stay behind because at a certain point it was overkill. He wasn't going to say anything, or he wasn't even going to appear. But the same could be said when a couple of years ago, when there was the collective bargaining negotiations, and the reporters were camped out. I think it was in Florida somewhere, and trying to get something from Manfred as he walked by and to and from the negotiating room, and that's not any different than what we did as reporters trying to stalk out Steinbrenner. And I would say that Steinbrenner was far more, even in his advanced age, when maybe he, cognitively was having some challenges, he was still an entertaining figure to cover, as opposed to the different executives with the CBA negotiations. Although those are just as important news events to cover and have to be covered.
I mean, back then we had Bill Gallo, the legendary sports writer and cartoonist for decades. He was still drawing Steinbrenner. Yep. He was General von, I can't remember the character's name. And he was, that was still going on. And so there was it was a symbiotic relationship between the personalities and the papers, and the papers against each other. It was you're right, it was a very interesting time that we may never, it's such a different, now it's
Well, the Daily News doesn't even have a newsroom anymore. It's crazy.
No. When I was there this past time, I was working from home. There was no newsroom. COVID killed the newsroom too. And now that building is being turned into an apartment building. So it's a crazy time. Oh, Christian, I appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I know we've gone probably a little longer than I anticipated, so I apologize.
No worries.
Maybe I could have policed a little better. But I didn't want to stop you because I enjoy your stories. Actually, I could have sat here for another hour, especially maybe getting you to talk about your trips to the Caribbean and to Central America. But
I'll save that for the next time.
Yes. Again, it's more stories with street cred is the Substack, and I'll even link. I'm going to link to the Spotify for the podcast as well, because the stories are. These are great stories, and if you have any appreciation just of good storytelling, it's not just sports just happens to be the thing that brings the narrative together, but it's about people, and Christian was good at doing that and is still good at doing that.
Well, I appreciate that, Ian. It's great to catch up with you.
Thanks so much for your time.
I wish you all the best, and thank you for having me on.
All right.
Have a good week.